When you don't take time to look at it through other people's eyes. Take some time and reflect on what you believe in your soul. Cause that is the key to life. You gotta let the negativity go.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the What the Fox podcast with Lindsey Fox and Amber Ross. Today, we're excited because we have a special guest, Dr. Adam Volungis, with us. And we're going to be covering something that I think is on a lot of our minds this time of year, perhaps finding a therapist, how to find a therapist, what to look for, and what red flags are out there, as well as green flags, right? Because I think for me, Lindsey, you and I were chatting, and from the outside looking in, as someone who does not currently have a therapist and doesn't have any experience in that field, I would take different paths than I think what you two would recommend. So I'm pumped for this, and I'm excited to get to know you more, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even on that note, Amber, your insight on this is going to be very helpful too, just because your perspective is going to be very different than how Adam and I are going to look at this. So just of note here, while I am a therapist, I have seen therapists, and I think through that process, I have really learned a lot of what the red flags and the green flags look like. And so I do think that's another reason in terms of talking about, what kind of questions can we ask a prospective therapist that we might want to hire to ensure that the goodness of fit is there. So I think that topic is really important to cover today as well. But with regard to our guest speaker, Dr. Adam Volungis, I actually know him because he was my professor in graduate school. So he is a professor at Assumption University in Worcester, Massachusetts. He's a counseling psychologist and licensed mental health counselor in the state of Massachusetts, where he has his own private practice. You guys are welcome to check that out if you'd like at drvcounseling.com. You can also see some of his research there. We worked together on a book in grad school, which is Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, Theory into Practice. Dr. V has another book that he recently came out with that he'll touch on in a second.
So what you're saying is you're both kind of a big deal.
Well, I don't know about me. I mean, I don't have the doctorate in this relationship, but yeah, I mean, Dr. V is kind of a big deal because he was actually just named as the next president of the New England Psychological Association. It's also known as NEPA, and
That's
he'll serve
awesome.
in this position for the next. Yeah. So
Thank you.
So he'll be serving in this position for the next 2 years. And Adam, if you want to touch on your most recent book, that would be awesome.
Oh, sure. So this is more for those that are looking to become a licensed mental health counselor. It says, let's see if I poke it up there like that. Becoming a mental health counselor, a guide to career development and professional identity. It's geared more towards graduate students, but some have also noted too that maybe undergraduates that are looking to go into graduate school counseling, it's helpful to kind of take a look at as well. Although, we'll talk a lot today about mental health counseling, what to look for and what to avoid. A lot of individuals that are looking to be therapists with regard to that book don't quite know what the field really entails until they really get into it. So there's a lot of unknown questions, and there aren't too many books and materials out there. There's a lot of books out like How to Get a Job. I used to use in one of my courses, What Color is Your Parachute, which is a great book, but there wasn't anything for the mental health field. So that was kind of the motivation behind that. And I will say that in the CBT book, Lindsey was a great client that she played in there as well. She, along with Mark Joyce, who was the other client in there, become very famous with my students. I have recorded videos that come with that book of me doing therapy with Lindsey and Mark. And there's still some really nice scenes of you and I heading into a local Big Y dealing with your panic attack. So you've left your mark on the students for many years.
That's awesome.
Thrilled that Assumption College, that the
students always will say, I don't tell them that you're one of my students to the end. And they're like, so she wasn't a real client? I'm like, no, she was acting. And they're like, whoa. Then I say, well, maybe there was a little bit of truth.
Yeah, just pretending to have panic disorder there, having a panic attack. Yeah, also, who's the Southern chick in Massachusetts having panic attacks at the grocery store? It was all the disruption in cultural norms. I couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I love it.
Yeah. So with that being said, just as we kind of dive into this topic, I think first things first, and just understanding the credentials. And so I'm wondering, Adam, if you can touch on the different types of credentials. So people can understand what that means. Because I think even whenever Amber and I were even touching on this topic, she's like, well, what's the difference between a counselor and a therapist, a psychologist, a psychiatrist? So maybe if you can just kind of touch on some of that a little bit, that would be helpful starting point.
Sure. I'll do the easiest one first. A psychiatrist typically will have an MD, and they're typically going to be one writing the medications, the scripts for you. Some do therapy, but most don't. These days, too, nurse practitioners, psychiatric nurse practitioners can also write scripts, and some will do therapy, too. Most people, when they envision someone doing, if you're looking to do therapy someday and you're imagining yourself, by the way, you're not laying back on the couch with your head on the pillow like old school.
Oh, man.
No, you don't taking naps. You're just sitting in two chairs facing each other and chatting with each other. Most of those people are going to have a master's degree in some form of counseling, or a PhD. And I say some form of counseling because every state varies in the title. Assumption College was counseling psychology. Now we're clinical counseling psychology.
That's right.
But all that matters is that the degree lead to licensure, to practice. And most people in the field will have master's degrees these days, which is a good thing. More and more of the last couple of decades, programs have been opening up where people are allowed to get generally a 2-year degree full time, about 60 credits. Again, it varies by state. Do a whole bunch more work postmasters, and eventually you get licensed to practice. A lot of PhDs will, go into academia and do research. But I'm a counseling psychologist where my PhD is, but my license is through my LMHC, a licensed mental health counselor. There is some myth that people might think like a psychologist with a PhD will be better than the master's level.
Yeah,
that actually isn't true. And this is coming from someone with a PhD.
I love that you're touching on this. I think this is such a good point.
And I say this to my students to advocate for them, because a lot of them goes, I want to get my doctorate, I want to get my PhD, or a PsyD. That's another, you can get a PsyD in clinical, now even counseling psychology. It's a different type of doctorate, but in the end, it can lead to licensure. Right. And I tell them, unless you've got a strong passion to research and teach, don't waste another 4 to 6 years of your life going back to school. Right. These individuals with their master's degree, like Lindsey or myself, whose license is through my master's degree, one of the most important qualities isn't so much the degree as more as this person does evidence-based practice, their actual training. Because there's a lot of work that goes into a PhD or a PsyD that's more research academic based, which is not a bad thing if that's your career focus.
That's right.
But I try to tell people that and there's also too, I don't want to forget, just thought of this too. There's a lot of people out there with MSWs that can be licensed clinical social workers. And those are also individuals that can provide therapy. So a lot of times you'll see a PhD after their name for therapy, an LMHC or an LPC, because it varies by state, or an LICSW or an LCSW. Those are the social worker licenses.
So many letters.
I know.
Well, and I'm thinking, as someone on the outside of this, right, as just like an average human being, I am completely baffled. If I were to decide tomorrow, I truly want to seek out like counseling services, therapy services. Like, this is something I want to dive into for, my new year. It's overwhelming for me as just a person who has no idea what all the credentials mean, what all of the different, designations behind your name mean, and not to discredit them at all, because I know they're valuable, but I look at them and I'm like, this looks like alphabet soup a little bit, because I have no idea what I'm looking at. And it's, for me, I think, Lindsey, what I was sharing with you, I said, okay, so the way that I process things is typically I'll do research and I'll figure out, okay, what do I want in a therapist or counselor, or, whatever I'm looking at, what do I need help with specifically? And then try to figure out who's recommended by, my healthcare, like my health insurance. And then within that, start crowdsourcing information, talk to people I know, go to Google University, whatever place to see reviews or what other people are saying. And I think, Lindsey, you brought up a great point when I mentioned that oftentimes people take time to review when they've had a negative experience, but not necessarily when they've had a positive experience, specifically on something as personal as therapy. So what are your recommendations there for helping us lay people weed through the details?
Yeah, well,
close your eyes and cross your fingers. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I will say this though about Lindsey. I'll let you answer too. I wasn't sure if it was directed to me or not. But Amber, the last piece you said about reviews online, it really varies. But I've just re-entered private practice over the past year. I've been licensed for a very long time, but doing the academic thing for a while. Some will argue in my field, and I would agree that it's generally unethical for us to even reply to those negative reviews, because then we're acknowledging that person that left the review was one of my clients. And so we're kind of if it's an average Joe Blow business, oh, this restaurant was stinky, I could politely respond, although not everyone does it politely. Hey, well, I'm sorry this happened, or this was my perspective of it. Most of us don't do that and kind of reply back to that.
Right. That's a good point. Not one I even considered.
Right, because it's when you think about HIPAA and protecting, confidentiality of a client, you can't respond to those sort of things unless you want to be faced with a potential lawsuit. So, we don't really go there. But I think you're bringing up a good point, Amber, in the sense that your average person probably just looks for general therapy and they're going to psychologytoday.com. They're just scoping out to see who's there. And then I think, a part of this and really a part of the relevance of this topic, today, especially starting a new year, is because we've been talking about the importance of just sort of like pressing that reset button and just wanting to sort of detox and start the year fresh. And then when you go to something like this, Psychology Today, and you see a list of different therapists or providers, you all of a sudden see that these providers have a laundry list, and I mean a laundry list of all of these treatment modalities that they can offer. So, right. Yeah, I hear that chuckle. I know where we're going with this. And that is that, so Adam mentioned something really important about evidence-based practice. So while I know what that is because I'm a therapist and I went to graduate school, that terminology kind of can get thrown around like, well, that sounds fancy. What's that mean? So, Adam, I'm wondering if you can comment a bit more on like what evidence-based practice actually means and why it's important. And also kind of like when we're looking at red flags versus green flags, when you see that a therapist has a number of treatment modalities, which, again, I think maybe for some of our listeners, whenever we reference treatment modalities, it's referencing like different kind of treatment interventions that are being used by that clinician in the context of treating signs and symptoms in therapy. So, Adam, I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit more about your thoughts on this particular topic with regard to specialties that therapists might list.
Sure. And one thing, just so I don't forget that I'll say too, before I get directly to your questions, Lizzie, was the whole letters after the name and all that piece. And if we have time, I'll even give some tips on how to find like a counselor online if we got time for that. Yeah. I'll be honest, a lot of my clients now, when I start talking about like if they find me on Psychology Today, for example, they'll be like, oh, you just look good, but I didn't even, oh, you're a psychologist or you have a PhD. Oh, what's an LMHC? So even the people that do research and do find you, they still don't quite know what that means. And later on, again, too, I can talk about ways to kind of check out license and credentials as well. Because I think some people, with all due respect to beginning, potential clients, you kind of take that for granted that the person in front of you is the expert. And most should be, don't get me wrong, but it is important to kind of check their background. Now, Absolutely. To Lindsey's point about evidence-based practices, that's kind of just a little bit of, not quite, a little bit of jargon for basically saying that what that person does therapeutically with their client is based on research. So there, and again,
because we like science.
We like science.
We like science.
I like science a lot, but I'm careful not to come on too strongly with that with clients because it can be a bit of a turnoff. But what's important to know is that what I'm doing with you clinically is based on science. So I got a client right now that I'm treating with PTSD. I'm doing prolonged exposure by Foe and colleagues. When I treat somebody with depression, I make sure I follow some type of Aaron Beck model. God rest his soul. He just passed away a couple weeks ago. The quote unquote father, I put that in quotes, father of CBT, but Judy Beck has carried that torch along the way. And for me, that's very important, very passionate for me, because there are many, many good licensed therapists and psychologists out there that do evidence-based practice. In my humble opinion, there's also maybe, I can't give you a percentage, but too good of a proportion of individuals that do not do evidence-based practice. Or they say they do on their website, but their actual practice, what they do in the room with the client, is not.
Right. Like maybe it's just like generic talk therapy type of thing.
And it's exactly what I was going to say. Therapy is more than just shooting the you-know-what with them. That's helpful. I always ask, how has your week been? But then it needs to go somewhere else. It's purposeful, it's directive.
It's interesting that you say that, because my assumption, and we all know what assumptions lead to, but my assumption is that someone who is a provider is providing service that's based in science. Like, to me, if you are like that,
whoa.
Yeah,
I'm gonna assume like if you're allowed to practice in my state, I'm gonna assume you're not just like making stuff up as we go. So it's alarming to me that you say that, because it never occurred to me that was an option. Like,
oh yes,
I really respect you, Amber, and I mean this in a sincere way, that you would think that not everyone that's seeking therapy would fully understand or appreciate that there is science behind psychology. Some may view as a pseudopsychology. Some may think, well, it's just some guy or gal that I can just talk to about my things. So there are some like you, Amber, don't get me wrong. I got especially clients that seek me out. They'll say, like, I like that you're CBT. I like that you're evidence-based practice. So they would be like you, a very informed consumer, but not, and I mean this respectfully to those who are looking to do therapy. Not everyone would understand or fully appreciate that there is science behind a good therapist or psychologist out there.
That makes sense. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's a lot of different lines there where people are looking for different things, and it just kind of, it depends on what you're looking for. But I think, for your average person, maybe you don't know what you're looking for. And I think that's where this gets scary, is like, you don't know what you don't know. And, when you're an informed consumer, you're actively researching and seeking those answers and trying to figure those things out. And so that's really what the point is of today's podcast, is to really help people understand what kind of questions you can ask your therapist or the prospective person you want to hire, because remember, you are hiring this person, and you also reserve the right to fire this person. You don't have, just like with any doctor that you might see. And so I do think it's important to keep in mind, like, questions to ask a therapist to kind of assess whether or not y'all have the same kind of value systems, for instance, whether or not, depending on what the concern or issue is that you're going to a person to discuss, you want to make sure that they are also an informed provider, So for instance, Adam just mentioned that he is seeing a client that has PTSD, right? So if you're wanting to go seek out treatment for PTSD, you want to go find an informed provider who really does have a comprehensive understanding around trauma and the effects of trauma and how to work through that. You're definitely not going to want to go to a therapist who maybe has more of a Freudian approach, where it's heavily rooted in psychodynamic aspects without an evidence-based practice to support sort of the treatment interventions that are designed to help reduce that person's, level of, how do I want to phrase it? Like in terms of their daily functioning, reducing their stressors, frankly, so that they can kind of, move through life a little bit more lightheartedly and more fluidly without as much distress.
Yeah, in terms of specific questions and stuff like that, I can give you a few, but I'll say right off the top of the bat, these days, most cases, when you find someone online, most of us, including myself, will do what's like a phone consultation, which is, it's a little bit different now. The last few years, we're more willing to do that type of stuff. Technology, yay. I mean, we can, teletherapy, all that kind of good stuff. And that basically, that 10, 15 minutes, when you schedule that phone conversation, you're going to get a chance to get a sense of their personality, their relationship. Now, this is coming from an evidence-based guy, CBT and other related approaches. it doesn't matter how good I may or may not be at CBT if I can't form that therapeutic relationship, that connection.
Absolutely.
And that 10, 15 minutes, again, you don't want to judge everything on 10, 15 minutes, but if you're getting that squirmy feeling in your stomach where you're not feeling connected and you're sure it's not because you're anxious, but it's because of this relationship that could potentially happen, those are some signals that tell you that maybe this might not be a good match. I argue to beginning therapists that we should be as malleable as possible, meaning flexible to clients as possible in terms of how we can match with them and treat them. But you as the client, you're the one in full control in terms of who you hire, who you like and don't like, and how you want to work. So the gist of it is, if you don't have a good therapeutic rapport with your therapist, you're not going to get anywhere with them.
Oh, absolutely.
I think this is important because I think some people confuse that rapport with a friendship. Right. And it's
boundaries.
It's not that feeling of friendship, but that feeling of, okay, I respect this person. I respect the information they're sharing with me and the guidance that they're giving me. And I feel comfortable and confident in sharing with them, but not like I'm going to go grab a drink with this person on Friday because we're friends. Like how do you tell where that line is and where that feeling is as you're setting it up? Because if you're seeking out therapy, most cases, like you have a targeted reason, something you're after, something you want to change, something you're trying to unpack. Like, where does that boundary exist and how do we find that?
That's tough to do it's a good question. It's tough to do in a phone consult unless somebody's really, as a therapist, really too inappropriate, really self-disclosing too much, which by the way is a warning sign.
Yeah.
You know, like, oh, wow, my wife and son, you wouldn't believe what my wife said to me last night. I'm like, we just met 5 minutes. Like, I think in any relationship, that's a runaway red flag type of thing. Amber said a good word that I like too, is, you know, I think I tell this to my students as well. Your goal is to be respected, not liked. Like as me as it's like, if you like me as a client, that's a bonus, but the goal is to be respected. It's a very unique relationship that we have. Keep in mind, say you're seeing your medical doctor. You know, I see my medical doctor once or twice a year. Although therapeutic, that rapport is important, it's not as important because I'm just going to see it for a few minutes and say goodbye. And you look at me a couple of minutes and type on your computer. You're going to see me, I typically once a week for about 50, 60 minutes for a good number of weeks. That's important. So there should be that relational piece, but I think it's important to understand that relationship ends outside of the office. Like this isn't some even clients would say like, oh, this could be a good person to be a friend with, but I also know that it would be inappropriate too. Like, so because I communicate that to my clients as well. Like, yeah, we're close in this room for this 50 minutes because you're self-disclosing personal information. And I use humor. I have fun, not everything's serious, but there's always this like there's boundaries too. Like it's nothing more than that therapeutic relationship. And that's unique in our profession because you do get connected close both ways with a client when they share stuff, and people, whether it's intentional or not, elicit certain emotions or thoughts about ourselves personally.
Of course.
But a good therapist will help keep you grounded with that.
Absolutely.
Especially if the client starts to challenge those borders a little bit, it's not on the client, it's on me to keep him or her in check, to just gently remind, this is what we're at, this is what we're focusing on.
That's right.
So I heard a red flag and a green flag. And sorry, Lindsay, I apologize for interrupting. The red flag I heard is oversharing on the therapist side, right? Like sharing personal information, because in this, that's not really expected. In most conversations, it's two-sided, but this one's really meant to be one person sharing and the other person like providing feedback. And the green flag I heard, which I loved, is that the therapist is the one holding the boundary, establishing and holding that boundary of, this is what you can expect from me. This is what I expect from you. And, inside this room is X, outside this room is Y, and this is how it's going to continue. And I think that's really important. Is that something you establish in first session, or is that something to look for in that like interview call?
The interview call is kind of hard to pick up on that unless somebody's way off target. Okay. And I will say too, just as an asterisk to your point, is you're right, Amber, about the self-disclosure, but it's an interesting topic. Like I do use some minimal self-disclosure. I think this is a judgment call among clinicians. It's more of how deep or how personal you get. Like, so like I might say to this client, like, that has children, like, oh yeah, I took my son out to a Revolution game this week. And how, like, I'll give like little basic kind of disclosure pieces. Sometimes I work with adolescents and they'll say, have you ever been bullied or teased before? And I'll say, yes. You know what I mean? Like, so there's a key element of self-disclosure is if I were to self-disclose a little bit, first, it's not uber personal, which I realize that's subjective. But the goal of that self-disclosure is not for me to gain from it, it's purposeful and has therapeutic value for the client.
Absolutely.
And there's clinical judgment on the psychologist or therapist on that. And it's also judgment on the client too. Because if you feel good with that and it's working, then that's a bonus. But if you're getting that squirmy feeling like, why is he sharing, his relationship struggles? Or why did we just spend 15 minutes talking about, I don't know, XYZ that's bothering him this week when that should have been about me? Those are screaming red flags there. You don't want any of that kind of stuff.
And so to your point, a part of being a provider is that our job, and honestly, I would argue this with all kinds of providers, our job is to role model the kind of behaviors that we would like to ultimately teach our clients to learn and to live out in their day-to-day lives. And so in terms of role modeling that, I do think that's something that we can accomplish within the consultation process. But I would like to provide some insight on types of questions that you could ask during the consult for a client to ask. So just a couple to review during the time that we have left here is to just ask, to just straight out of the gate, let them know if you have any let your therapist know or potential provider know if you have any kind of scheduling restraints. If you can only meet during the weekends or the evenings, that's a really important thing to establish right off the bat. And then if you have kind of, depending on what your identified problem is, maybe if you're a stay-at-home mom and you're wanting to seek assistance and just kind of processing out some identity work, or maybe if there's some kind of sexuality or gender identity concerns, it would be good to ask that person, that potential provider, what kind of experience do you have with fill in the blank? So that you can learn more about that provider right off the bat. Like, have they ever worked with someone who's experienced, gender identity concerns or sexuality concerns, or, questioning or trying to do that exploration work. So, I think that's an important piece. And then also asking, in terms of your approach, what does a typical session look like? You can learn more about what that provider offers and what their style is and what their treatment approach is by asking something like that. And also kind of setting the expectation of what goals that you might have with regard to, are you seeking short-term immediate relief and you only want to have a couple sessions? Maybe it's private pay, or you only have a limited number of sessions with your insurance. How long do you typically see clients? Asking that question so a provider can kind of give you feedback around what their expectations are and how they typically operate is another key area to hone in on. And also making sure that you ask the provider, do you have any questions for me? Because that's one that I don't think gets asked a lot by a client to a provider. Maybe the assumption is that the provider would just outwardly just ask the question. But I think sometimes that's helpful, because that goodness of fit is ultimately going to be what establishes the rapport that is essential and critical in moving forward in that treatment process.
I'm going to sideline you for a bit because you got the wheels turning. What is an example of a question, Lindsey, that you would ask a potential client? Like, if I said that to you, I was interviewing you, what would you ask me?
So I can think of someone, for instance, who was heavily faith-based, for instance, right? And they didn't say anything right off the bat within the consult, but I asked them, how important is your faith to you during this treatment planning process? Because right off the bat, that helped me understand, okay, is this going to be something that I need to have a different kind of approach in supporting this client? Because that also, religious beliefs, as an example, is something that really kind of steers the way that we're looking at the world, right? It's another filter of how we look at the world and how we perceive things that are occurring in our lives. So I think on our end, we can ask those kind of questions, because obviously maybe if that person is really in a space where they want a faith-based counselor or something, and it's going to be more than what I can offer, that's a potential treatment barrier that we can address right off the bat within that consultation process.
That's a really good point.
right? And so just a couple of, let's see here, just taking a look at our time here. We've got about 5 minutes left. So, just with that being said, I think another really important question to ask might be saying, like, what's your view on psychotropic medication? I mean, like, what if you're seeing a provider who, or doing a consult with a provider who has more of a holistic approach, and maybe that's not listed on Psychology Today.
Yeah.
You might want to have an idea of how that person views certain topics and how that might affect your treatment in that sense. You know what I mean?
There's so many variables. I feel like there's not a good way to concisely say, here's how you find a therapist or a provider that is going to be a good fit for you. But I think the red flags, the green flags are kind of a good indicator in how to get started. But do you see it happen often where a client or a provider fires the other one just because it's not working? Or, is that, I understand a client can definitely fire a provider, but is it allowed the other way around? Like, does that happen? Odd question, I know, but inquiring minds want to know.
Sure. It does happen. I think that it does happen in the sense that, a provider needs to have awareness of maybe their own biases towards certain topics. Maybe you need to refer out that client to another provider who is more specialized in whatever it is, because frankly, part of our code of ethics is to do no harm, right? So if we have a client where, again, how I mentioned, Adam is seeing someone with PTSD. If you really have no, real solid experience of working with someone with PTSD, yet you keep holding on to that client, you kind of have to look at whether or not it's really justified in that sense. Like maybe that client should be seeing a specialist. In addition, there could be like some housekeeping items, like maybe you have a three no call, no show policy.
Yeah.
And that person just keeps canceling. So that's why you have an intake paperwork at the beginning of your first session, to kind of address a lot of those things. Adam, did you have anything to add on that?
Me firing clients would be pretty rare. A good phone consult would take care of that. So Lindsey listed a bunch of questions that one should ask, making a phone consult. I'd argue that a good provider, if the client's not asking them, the provider would be, I would be asking those questions myself. I would never take on a client without having a full understanding of what their presenting issues are. So there can always be surprises in therapy. Maybe someone says, I'm working on depression, and 6 sessions in, they say, I'm addicted to heroin. I may have to refer that person out to someone that's more of an expert. So if it's, I don't like this client and they're mean to me, I would say like that's not professional. Yeah. You gotta deal with that. I got adolescent clients that sometimes swear at me and don't want to be there. That's my job. But if somebody's outside my scope of expertise, for example, I'm not an expert eating disorders, and that comes up, it would be professionally appropriate to say, hey, and it's also our job too. You don't just say goodbye. I'll help you consult. I'll get you a list of referrals. I will talk to these people. I'll help you with that process. So I mean, it definitely can happen, but I think a good psychologist or therapist will try to keep that as a minimum, moving forward. But there can be some surprises. The biggest thing for me is going outside of scope of practice. And a good psychologist or therapist will know that too. They're not going to pretend it or fake it and act like they can do it. And that's concerning too. I always say that no matter what profession it is, always, especially of ours, be leery of mental health professionals that say that I can treat any population and any disorder all the time. Nobody can do that. Even the quote unquote experts, I'm an expert in few areas, but not everything.
Yeah.
We all have our limitations, and a good, secure professional therapist will know his or her limitations and be open about it. And that's okay.
I think that's awesome. And I know this has been such a valuable conversation for me, because I have a very different experience and perspective on this, and kind of the layperson. So I appreciate y'all sharing all of the information, all of the tips and tricks and what to look out for. Adam, if people want to find you or want to learn more about you, or perhaps grab your books, is there a place they can do that?
Both of my books can be found on Amazon if they're really that interested. And it was mentioned before, drvcounseling.com would be the best place to learn about my practice and background.
Awesome.
And I would say, I know we got very quickly, just before we go, if people are like off the top of my head, usually the best places to start searching online is Psychology Today. Go from there. In the upper left-hand corner, there's a spot that says website, click it. And also helloalma.com is a great place that services clients, because not just office therapy, but teletherapy is becoming a really common use of doing therapy now too.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
And we'll link those in the podcast too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us today. We do hope to make this a regular thing to have you come on monthly to just discuss a different mental health topic each month. And this has been fantastic just to get our feet in the door to figure out where do we start with this whole process.
Oh my gosh, what a fun conversation with Dr. Adam Volungis today. I know he brought in a whole different level of insight to this conversation. I know that we were able to dig into a little bit of the alphabet soup of credentials. Hopefully that makes a little more sense now, and helping you to understand what providers are, what stands behind them, what education they have, and what they have to offer. We began to scratch the surface on red flags and green flags, and, really establishing that client-provider rapport. Absolutely expect for us to talk about this again in the future, because it's super important. And it's something that I think I can speak for you, Lindsey, that we feel passionate about, because
absolutely
you don't know what you don't know.
And right. And there's so much left to say on all of these topics. There's so much left to say. So we're definitely going to have to cover more on this in future episodes for sure.
Well, and lucky us, we get to meet with Adam probably once a month moving forward. So we'll get to bring in that expertise and that different perspective moving on. And I think that we'll be providing after this, not in the episode, but in the resource section, some additional opportunities for you to be able to find a provider that fits for you. So based on your specific needs, based on your where you sit presently, we're going to be giving you some of those good, solid resources to get you off and running on your search.
Absolutely. And as always, don't forget to follow us on our Instagram account. The handle is What the Fox Podcast. And you can always choose to follow us individually as well, where our information is in the link in bio as well.
Yep, absolutely. And if you have questions, if you have topics, please don't be afraid to email us at whatthefoxtales@gmail.com. That is whatthefoxtales@gmail.com. Don't let that trip you up. But we're so grateful for you, and we look forward to chatting with y'all again soon. Have a good one.
And we all sing, everything is gonna be just fine. It's gonna fall into place. The sun is gonna set on your terrible day.